Welcome back. In the last lecture, we saw Rawls' theory of justice. Now, Rawls holds such monumental stature in political philosophy, in modern political philosophy, that everything that has been written after Rawls has been some or other way influenced by Rawls. And and contemporary as Western political thought can be considered as footnotes to Plato. Contemporary political philosophy can be considered as footnotes to Rawls, because everything in Western political thought has been one or other way be influenced by Plato, and contemporary political philosophy in one or other way has been influenced by Rawls. So a lot of people have criticized Plato, and on the similar lines, a lot of people have criticized Rawls as well. You see people like libertarians, communitarians, feminists, Marxists, and liberals. Everyone has criticized Rawls. In that series, the first kind of philosophers who criticized Rawls were libertarians, and among libertarians, first, or the person who criticized Rawls was Nozick. Nozick, in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Anarchy, State, and Utopia. This is 1974 book. Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Right? Who was Nozick? Nozick was libertarian. We have studied libertarian and neoliberal ideas. Once in ideologies topic, we understood views of Friedrich Hayek. We understood views of Friedman, and we studied Nozick as well. Right? We studied Nozick as well. Right? Who was Nozick? Nozick was number one, a neoliberal. Who were neoliberals? Neoliberals are critics of welfare state. Critics of welfare state. It is an ideology like end of ideology. No, it is not end of ideology. It talks about development, but it still is it still is proponent of neoliberalism. So they are critics of welfare state. They support minimal night watchman state. Right? They think state as an empire, and they think and state for them is regulatory state, a night watchman state, a minimal state. Right? Neoliberals are critics of welfare state, of minimal state, and they support night watchman state. For neoliberals, progressive taxation is bonded labor. For neoliberals, planning is road to serfdom. So very much against socialist ideas of any kind, very much against welfareism, very much against social justice. Right? For Nozick himself, on state, he says that minimal state is inspiring as well as right. So he talks about minimal state. What is minimal state? A state which performs only regulatory functions, a state which maintains only law and order, does not do anything else. Right? Nozick as a person is a neoliberal. We are studying libertarian critique of Rawls, and Nozick is a neoliberal, hardcore, hardcore, uh, hardcore proponent of property, hardcore proponent of property rights. For Nozick, minimal state is inspiring as well as right. So he says that there is need of some kind of state, right? He does not say there should be anarcho-capitalism, right? As given by Rothbard. Anarcho-capitalism talks about a system where there is no states. Even the functions of maintaining law and order is performed by capitalist entities. So justice is privatized, policing is privatized, everything is privatized in anarcho-capitalism. Nozick does not support this. He supports minimal state, which does umpiring functions, night watchmaning functions, and regulatory functions. Right? Like any other neoliberal libertarian, who are going to be influences on Nozick. Influences are very important to understand so that we are able to figure out the thinking of a philosopher. So first influence will be Locke. Locke talks about absolute right to property. Right to property. Locke talks about absolute right to property. For Locke, property is a natural right. For Locke, property is a natural right. And in in justifying property and in justifying property rights, what does what does Nozick say, or what does Locke say? Locke say that property is of the person who applies their labor on it. One who applies labor, that is why property is made. That is the view of Locke's, right? Locke says that property was once held in common. People who were entrepreneurial, people who wanted to worked on that property, made that property valuable. That is why that property should belong to said person. These were the views of Locke on property. This is the first influence. Second influence is surprisingly Kant. Kant gives his function, or his not function, but his concept. Kant gives his concept of categorical imperative. Categorical imperative. One of his categorical imperatives is dignity. His dignity. Nozick uses categorical imperative of Kant in the way which is hard to understand, right? Which is hard to understand. He says that he says that Kantian dignity principle should be applied to rich. Dignity should be applied to rich. Right? Dignity should be applied to rich. And dignity of a rich person should be upheld, and and rich should not be used as means to poor's ends, to make poor's life better, to bring social justice in poor's life. Taxation on rich is no way, is not a means. Rich should not be used as means to poor ends. To bring social justice, state cannot use rich or hardworking as means, right? And he says that state, he I mean Nozick, and Nozick says that state is limited to state is limited to rectifactory justice. State is limited to rectifactory justice and not distributive justice. So state's position as given by Rawls is of advancing greatest advantage to least advantaged. That is the position of state in Rawlsian theory of justice, right? So by one way or another, state does job of distribution, and state state states or idea of justice as given by Rawls is distributive justice, but libertarian Nozick's theory of justice or function of state is limited to rectifactory justice and umpiring functions. State's role is limited to rectification of wrongs. So influences on Nozick are these. First is Locke for right to property. Second is Kant for dignity of rich, whereby rich cannot be used as means to ends of poor. And on these lines, whereby state is limited to rectifactory justice and not distributive justice, on these lines, Nozick give his entitlement theory of justice. If asked in exam, you can write that it is a theory of rectifactory justice, not distributive justice. You can write this. Why? Because he limits function of state to rectification, right? Entitlement theory of justice, the first principle that is given by Nozick in entitled theory. I can state all three principles at once. So he gives three principles, whereby three R's: just acquisition, just acquisition, just transfer, and just rectification. These are three components of his theory of justice. These are three principles of Nozick's theory of justice. I'll start with right to acquisition. Right, I missed one thing. I should have mentioned that it is a right-based theory. It is a rights-based theory. It is a rights-based theory. Rawls' theory is not rights-based. Rawls' theory uh, was principle-based, and Rawls' theory was more on the side of equality of opportunity, giving liberty, and not on Rawls did not speak much about rights. Right? We don't have, at least we don't have anything which says that he talked about rights at all. But entitlement theory of justice as given by Nozick is rights-based theory. It is a theory of rectification, and it has three principles: just acquisition, just transfer, and just rectification, of which first is right to acquisition or just acquisition. What is just acquisition? Just acquisition is basically the idea, is basically the idea which says that property was property was once held in common. Property was once held in common. When property was once held in common, when property was once held in common, and then some people applied their slaves, their horses, and their physical and mental labor on that property, on that piece of land, on that machine or anything like that. And those who applied labor, physical, mental labor of horse and labor of slave, got ownership of that property, right? Got ownership of that property. When that person got ownership of that property, then that acquisition is just acquisition, right? There is property that is held in common. There are two persons, A and B. A is entrepreneurial, B is idle. A performs labor on this piece of land, B does nothing, and that is why A is rightful owner of this piece of land, right? Just acquisition or right to acquisition, this concept or this principle mean that one who applies labor on a piece of property that once was held in common is rightful owner of that property. This is the just acquisition principle, right? This is just acquisition principle. And once they acquire that land by adding value to the property that they have, right? From a barren piece of land, this person A created a good amount of value. That is why this land belongs to A, and after acquiring this land, the person A has absolute right to property. Absolute right to property on this piece of land. What does absolute right to property mean? Right to property mean that whatever they want to do with this piece of land, they can do that. They can leave that land barren again. They can apply labor on that land. They can sell that land. They can transfer that land. They can lease that land. So the absolute ownership and absolute right to property lies with the person who applied labor on a piece of property and created value in that property. This is the first principle which talks about just acquisition or right to acquisition. The second principle is right to transfer or just transfer. Right to transfer or just transfer, right? Right to transfer or just transfer. This principle, this principle basically says that the person who has applied their labor on a piece of land, created value on a piece of land, this piece of land is their property. Absolutely, they have right to ownership on this property. Absolutely, they have absolute right to property on that piece of property. when such person who have absolute right to property, such person also have right to transfer or just transfer. Basically, this principle basically means if you have right to property, you can you can transfer your property to whomsoever you want. State has no say in that. State has no say in that. Right? So in case of land reforms, whom do you think whom do you think libertarians will side with? They will side with the zamindars, right? They will side with the zamindars. They will say that zamindars are the owners of that property. State has no right to acquire property of a zamindar. The person who is owner of that property has absolute right to property, and nobody including state can dictate what one is going to do with that piece of land. Nobody can dictate that. And the third principle is right to justification, right to rectification, or just rectification. Right to rectification or just rectification. So basically what Nozick wants to say is that if 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 your property if a property is not acquired in rightful manner or transferred in rightful manner, right? If basically he wants to say, if a property does not follow first two principles of just acquisition and just rectification, just transfer, right? If property does not follow just acquisition or just transfer, then then the only function of state is to do just the rectification. That is the only function of state. That is the only function of state. Only function of state is to rectify if a property is not acquired in rightful manner. Right? These are three principles. Just acquisition, just transfer, and just rectification. So this theory, which is supposed to be a theory of distributive justice, does not distribute anything. Says that if you are an owner of property, you will continue to be the owner of that property. And all this theory says is that if your right to property is violated, then state will come into picture, and then state will do work of rectification. So this theory is not a distribution based theory. This is a rectification based theory, and it is a rights based theory because it does rectification of rights. But Nozick himself says that there are some limitations on right to property. Right to property, even though he says it is absolute, but there are some limitations of right to property according to Nozick. Some limitations on right to property. First limitation on right to property is right to property cannot be exercised in such a way that right to property cannot be exercised in such a way that it puts others' life or property in danger. The second limitation is You cannot exercise your right to property in a such a way that it deprives other person of their rights. So your exercise of right to property cannot deprive other person of of their right to property, right? You cannot put others life to property in danger. You cannot exercise your right to property in a such a way that you you deprive other person of their right to property. And third limitation is that you cannot spoil your right, your property, right? You have absolute right to property, but you cannot spoil your property, right? This is the idea of Nozick's theory of state. This is the basic idea of Nozick's theory of state, whereby he says he says there are three principles of a theory of justice, entitled theory of justice, that he says people are entitled to. This entitlement means people are entitled to right to acquisition, right to transfer as absolute right to property, and right to rectification. But he also sets some limitations on right to property, whereby right to property cannot be exercised in a such a way that it puts others' lives or property in danger. You you cannot exercise your right to property in a such a way that you deprive other person of their right to property, and you cannot spoil your property. You cannot spoil your property. These limitations were used by US state to attack Saddam Hussein in Iraq, right? We are going to understand Iraq war in great detail in IR. Still, this was one of the reasons why US attacked Saddam Hussein's Iraq, because he was spoiling his oil reserves, right? This was this was the reason why US attacked Saddam Hussein, right? And this is also the reason that you why Nozick is against monopoly capitalism. Monopoly capitalism, monopoly capitalism has one player only. If a capitalism has one player only, then that player cannot become a, a only player in market if that player has not deprived others of their property, and that player has not threatened other person of their property, right? With this theory, with this theory, how do you think? How do you think Nozick criticized Rawls? With this theory, how do you think Nozick criticized Rawls? There is no even a inch of criticism within this whole theory. Rawls talked about other thing. Nozick talked about altogether other thing. No, Rawls talked about distributive justice. Nozick talked about rectifactory justice. Effectively, he talked about rectifactory justice. So we have to understand the topic as relevant to Rawls. So we will pivot to will actually pivot. This was his views on justice. Now we'll pivot to Nozick's criticism of Rawls, right? Nozick's criticism of Rawls. Rawls, right? Rawls is a social liberal. For Rawls, dignity is fundamental principle of his theory of justice, right? Rawls is a social liberal, and for Rawls, dignity is fundamental principle of his theory of justice. For him, for Rawls, justice as fairness is based on dignity, is based on inviolability of human dignity, right? If Rawls talks about dignity in such a detail and talks, he is a social liberal, he will criticize utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, as we have studied in Bentham, says Pushpin is as good as poetry, right? Utilitarianism says between pleasures, between pleasures, there is no differentiation. One pleasure is equally good than other. Utilitarianism does not have any core principle at core of it except pleasure. Utilitarianism does not care about human dignity. This utilitarianism, this utilitarianism was criticized by Rawls. This utilitarianism was criticized by Rawls as end state theory. What is an end state theory? End state theory basically is a theory which talks about goals, which defines goals, right? Like Plato's philosopher king is a end state theory, talks about a a system on top of which philosopher king will sit at, right? For Plato, end goal of his theory is philosopher king. Hannah Arendt does not talk about the goal. Oh, sorry, Hannah Arendt does talk about goal. End state theory. So Plato's PK is end state theory because it has a goal. Then Marx is also end state theoretician, whereby you see you see that final goal is defined in Marxist doctrines. Final goal is revolution. Rawls criticizes utilitarianism to be end state theory because it violates human dignity, right? This whole point that Rawls, right, read this in one line. Rawls criticizes utilitarianism to be end state theory because it violates human dignity. Rawls criticizes human dignity. Rawls criticizes utilitarianism because it violates human dignity, right? This line that Rawls criticizes utilitarianism because it it violates human dignity. This whole line was criticized by was criticized by Nozick, as Rawls also Rawls also sacrifice dignity of rich in favor of poor. Rawls also sacrifice dignity of rich in favor of poor. So Rawls himself violates his own principle. Rawls himself violates his own principle, right? What we are studying, we are basically studying how Nozick criticized Rawls. right? Nozick gave criticism of a criticism, whereby Rawls criticizes utilitarianism to be end state theory. Rawls criticizes utilitarianism to be end state theory and says that utilitarianism sacrifices human dignity, right? Utilitarianism sacrifices human dignity. This whole chain of chain of thoughts that Rawls criticizes utilitarianism as it sacrifices human dignity was criticized by Nozick in saying that Rawls himself sacrifices human dignity of rich by talking in favor of poor. Right? This was the first criticism as given by Nozick. This was criticism number one. The second criticism as given by Nozick is for Rawls, rights takes precedence over good. For Rawls, individual autonomy, for Rawls, individualism, right? For Rawls, individual freedom of choice takes priority over good of the society, good of the society. But what Rawls does not do is accept or recognize right to property. How? Why and how Rawls does not recognize absolute right to property? Absolute right to property. By saying that distribution should happen in such a way that it leads to greatest advantage to least advantaged. Basically, what Rawls wants to do by his system of distribution is take from the rich and give to poor. If for Rawls right is prior to good, why does he not recognize absolute right to property? And why does he say that the system of distribution should be in such a way that should be in such a way that it recognizes greatest advantage or it gives greatest advantage to least advantaged, right? You say on the other hand right is prior to good, individual autonomy of self, individualism, all those things. On the other hand, you say we should go to and we should do greatest advantage to least advantage. So Rawls does not accept or not recognize absolute right to property, and that is why Nozick gives a rights-based theory whereby for him three property rights of acquisition, transfer, and rectification are absolute. So Nozick gives rights-based theory. His theory is theory of entitlement, entitlement or property, entitlement or property. For Nozick, rights-based theory means one thing, that states only job is to rectify rectify state's only job is to rectify and preserve rights, rectify wrongs and preserve rights. This is the only job of the state, right? He says state's only job is to rectify wrongs and preserve rights. He does not give end goal for a state. For Marx, end goal is no state. For Plato, end goal is philosopher king. For Aristotle, end goal is polity. For Machiavelli, there is no end goal, leave him. For Locke, end goal is right to property. Maybe Locke does not fit, other fit. So the goal, there is no goal for the state. Only job that state has is to rectify wrongs and preserve rights. Basically, what he wants to say that liberal theory needs to be rights based, and Rawls theory is not rights based, and that is why it is an end state theory as well, because it defines a goal. Because it defines a goal, right? Why it is an end state theory? Because it is not purely procedure. What is procedural? What is purely procedural? We are going to understand now, right? We are understanding Nozick's criticism of Rawls. The first criticism is that Rawls does not uphold his own principle of dignity by violating dignity of the rich. The second principle is that Rawls say that right to property is or takes priority to good of the society. Then why does not he recognize right to property, and why does he say we should distribute according to this principle of greatest advantage to least advantage? Because Rawls does not recognize absolute right to property, Nozick gives his theory rights-based theory, whereby the only job that state does is to rectify and preserve rights. And Nozick says that if you are not rectifying or preserving rights, you are not a liberal theory. You are not, and if you are defining goals, you are an end state theory. And he says that only purely procedural theories are his end state theory, are not only procedural theories are not end state theories. So he gives categorization of theories in categorization of procedural theories. The first categorization of theories is perfectly procedural. Perfectly procedurals defines goals. Perfectly procedural theory defines procedure as well. Example of perfectly procedural theory will be Plato's theory of justice. What is goal of Plato's theory of justice? To establish a system which will make Athens great again and to put philosopher king in power. This is the goal of Plato's theory of justice. His whole idea of justice revolved around justifying Plato's philosopher king. His philosopher king should get to power. That was his whole point. Effectively, that was his whole point. Right? So goal is defined. And procedure is also defined. Education, theory of education, if you read, then theory of communism, if you read, then theory of myth of metals, if you read, theory of justice, if you read, everything revolves around this. All this procedure revolves around his philosopher king. So end goal is defined, procedure is also defined. If both of these things are defined, then theory is perfectly procedural. That is a end state theory. 100% it is a end state theory because it defines goals as well as procedure. Perfectly procedural theory. The second kind of theory is imperfectly procedural theory. Imperfectly procedural theory. In such kind of theories, goal is defined, procedure is not. Procedure is not. Goal is defined, procedural not. Procedure is not. Procedure is not. For Gandhi, goal is Swarajya, Hindavi Swarajya. For Gandhi, goal is Swarajya, but he does not define procedure for per se. Right? He does not define procedure per se. Other people talked about Swadeshi, other people talked about a lot of things. Apart from non-violence as a categorical imperative, apart from non-violence as a deontological principle, he does not define means. He just says that you cannot use wrong means. So in Gandhi's theory, goal is defined in Swarajya. Procedure is not defined. You can take any procedure as long as it does not goes against his core principle of non-violence. Right? Another example is Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt's goal is to establish a society which is civic republican. She wants to establish a society in which every person is a zoon politikon. But does she say anything about procedure? No. She just says that this is the goal. Whatever you want to do to get to this goal, it is okay. So imperfectly procedural theory in which goal is defined, procedure is not. And third kind of theories are purely procedural. Purely procedural theory. Goal is not defined, neither is procedure. For this theory, Nozick is there. Nozick. What is the goal of Nozick's theory? Nothing. He just wants to say that my right to property is absolute, and state's only goal is to rectify wrongs done with respect to my right to property. Procedure, there is not even mentioned of procedure. So goal and procedure, if both are not defined, such theory is procedural theory. Right? This is the first categorization as given by Nozick. The second thing he says about procedural theory, purely procedural theory, he says that only ahistorical only ahistorical and unpatterned theory only ahistorical and unpatterned theory can be purely procedural. Only ahistorical and unpatterned. Right? What does this mean? What does this mean? Ahistorical basically means that you're not taking account of historical injustices. Ahistorical means no account of historical injustices. And unpatterned means no account of socio-economic situation. Right? No account of two things. First, history. Second, pattern. For Nozick, only ahistorical and unpatterned theory can be purely procedure. The first categorization is very simple, whereby you don't define even goals or procedure, you are purely procedural. The second definition that Nozick gives, he says that only ahistorical and unpatterned theory can be purely procedural. What does this mean? This basically means that You are not taking account of any historical injustice, and you are not taking account of socio-economic situation, which Rawls does the both. He says that historically marginalized people, right, by saying poor, he is saying historically marginalized poor should be worked on, greatest advantage to least advantage, unpatterned, not taking account of any socio-economic situation. Again, he talks about poverty. Again, he talks about talent, right? So, Nozick says, my theory is purely procedural. By purely procedural, my theory does not talk about any end goal. That is why my theory is not end state theory, but Rawls's theory is both ahistorical, is both unpatterned, talks about goals, defines procedure as well. That is why Rawls' theory is patterned, is historical, and that is why Rawls' theory is end state theory. This is basically the criticism of Rawls, right? This is basically the criticism of Rawls, whereby he says that your theory is end state, that is why your theory is not good. But he does not take into account the social justice that Rawls theory is doing, but he does not take into account the principles of human dignity and all those things that Rawls theory provides. If your theory is end state theory, it does not matter your theory is like the best of the theories. Even if your theory define end goal, it does not matter. But Nozick presented it as a criticism. So we are going to write it as a criticism that Rawls theory, according to Nozick, is ahistorical and historical and patterned. It defines goals and procedure as well. So what are the three criticisms as given by Nozick? The first criticism is dignity criticism, whereby Rawls sacrifices dignity of the rich in favor of poor. So the first criticism is dignity of rich in favor of the poor. Second criticism is, even though Rawls talk about rights to be prior to good, he does not accept or recognize absolute right to property. This is the second criticism. Third criticism is that Rawls theory is a end state theory because it is ahistorical. Because it is historical. Rawls theory is historical, patterned, defines goals and procedures as well. These are the basic three criticisms as given by Nozick on Rawls theory of justice. From the next lecture, we'll start with feminist critique of Rawls theory of justice. I hope this helped. And from the next lecture, we'll start with feminist critique of Rawls theory of justice, and we'll start with Susan Moller-Okin and her book Gender Justice and Family, and her article 48 Acres and a Mule for Women. Thank you so much. I hope this was quite helpful session to you, and I will come back with feminist theory of justice and feminist critique of Rawls theory of justice. Three people we are going to study: Susan Moller-Okin, Carol Pateman, and Carol Gilligan. Thank you so much. We'll start with feminist theory of justice from the next lecture. Bye.